Livy and Love, Olivia Langdon, back to USA. After he returned to America, Mark Twain had a number of job offers, but as always, he wanted to try something new. Doing what he had done before wasn't enough. He liked the challenge of a new experiences, new ideas, new conquest. While he was trying to make up his mind whether or not to go back to newspaper work, he received a letter from the American Publishing Company of Hartford asking him if he had thought of collecting his newspaper sketches together in a book. The idea excited him and he began gathering his material for a book he called Innocents Abroad. That Christmas, Charles Langdon came down to New York and invited Sam to come to his hotel and meet his family. Your sister is with them, Mark asked eagerly, remembering the picture he had seen on the Quaker City. Langdon laughed. Yes, he said, but don't think you or anyone else has a chance. She has always been frail and I guess we have spoiled her. But one thing is certain, she spoiled us. We would not dream of letting her go away with anyone. 2 days before Christmas, Sam met the one and only woman in his life, Olivia Langdon. He had been invited to dinner, and the moment he walked through the door, he knew that his fate was set. One look at Davy confirmed the fact that she was everything Charles Langdon had said and more. Olivia was very small and fragile, partially bedridden from an accident she had suffered on ice when she was 16. At the time that Mark Twain met her, she was 22, with enormous dark eyes in which the depth of her nature was mirrored. The rest of her features were small and patrician. She wore her jet black hair parted in the center and looped behind her neck in a large, glistering coil that seemed to hang like a great black pod on the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale and white. She moved with grace and quietness, a small shy figure in an enormous hooped skirt. Mark Twain was awkward and intimidated at first, thinking himself an uncultured Westerner among the civilized Easterner. But gradually his warm, expansive nature opened up and he soon had the whole table laughing at his anecdotes. Everyone but Livy, that is. She kept looking at him as if he were some strange specimen out of a rodeo. Charles Dickens, the noted British writer, author of A Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, and many other well-known books, was giving a reading that night, and the Langdon family invited Mark to accompany them to the lecture hall. Mark was intrigued by the consummate acting of Dickens, who, dressed in a black velvet jacket with a pearl flower at his buttonhole, seemed to Mark Twain everything that he was not. Mark was the free, exuberant, uninhibited, sometimes vulgar, but always honest spirit of America. Dickens was the cultured, cultivated, polished Englishman of letters. Sitting in the darkened lecture hall, Mark began to feel his own inadequacies. How could he make the girl sitting next to him love him for what he was? She was used to fancy dandies like her brother and father, good men, of course, but different, like Charles Dickens up there, no, there on the platform. He, Mark Twain, was only a man who spoke his mind even when it would have been better to keep silent. And he knew he would never change, even for Livy, but he had to have her. That much he knew, too. The question was how. He felt he was making some progress when he received an invitation to make a New Year's Day call at a friend's house where the Langdon family was receiving guests. He and Livy's brother Charles arrived at 11 in the morning, and although it seemed that the moments flew by, he stayed more than 12 hours, not leaving until after midnight. Mark Twain was now determined to finish his book and to make it as good as he could so that he could prove to Livy that he was worthy of her love. He had a job in Washington as secretary to Senator William Stewart, but he found the chores tedious, but he found the chores tedious and the work uninspiring. More and more he devoted his time to polishing up his book. Then an unexpected blow fell. The publishers of a paper in California had his series of letters copyrighted, and they notified him that they were going to bring out a book of those letters. Mark Twain was thunderstruck, but Colonel John McComb, the editor of Alta California, showed the spirit of the West, the spirit of decency, which was to characterize the new states once they were free of lawless elements. Colonel McComb, even though he knew the paper would lose a great deal of money, and even though the owners said the letters belonged to the paper, followed the dictates of his conscience without regard for his job, and knowing that he was taking an unpopular position with his employers. He said that Mark Twain was right. The letters ought to belong to him. They were, after all, his work. After Colonel McComb's voice was raised in opposition to his own employers, other voices joined him. Finally, Mark was allowed to use the material for his own book. The book was finished in July of that year, 1869. Tired but triumphant, Mark used his first freedom from work to make a trip to Elmira to visit the Langdon family. He was so excited at the prospect of seeing Livy he seemed not to be able to think about anything else. When Charles Langdon met him at the station, he was appalled at Mark's appearance. Odd Western clothes or not, Mark was warmly welcomed by Mr. and Mrs. Langdon. But Olivia was polite and no more. No matter what enticements Mark used to try to win her around, she remained aloof, polite but distant. Charlie finally confided to Mark that he wasn't giving her a chance. He had been so busy talking about himself and trying to make a good impression that Olivia had not been able to say a word. Considerably chastened, Mark then fell into a glum silence. At the end of 3 days, it was obvious to everyone that he was wildly, hopelessly in love with Olivia, and the Langdons were upset. The Langdons could not have been more different from the people Mark Twain had known. The Langdons were sternly practicing Congregationalists who thought of tobacco and alcohol as the sins of the fallen. They regarded strong language as the sign of devil. Mark had been known to be friendly with all three. Nevertheless, they liked Mark well enough, but as Charles' friend, not as Livy's suitor. Mr. Langdon finally spoke to him, trying to be kind, but telling him that his suit was hopeless. In despair, Mark made arrangements to leave. At the door, he thought he detected looks of relief on all the faces about him, and he felt that if he left them in this state, he would never get another invitation from the Langdons. But what was he to do? It was obvious that they were all glad he was going. Charles was at the door. Mark pressed Livy's hand warmly. She smiled but took a step back. No, there was nothing to do. The coach was waiting to take him to the station. He stepped up on the open step and into the coach behind the driver. He and Charles were waving goodbye, and at that instant the horse she bolted and gave the carriage a violent jolt. The seat was loose. The two men were thrown to the floor. Mark was dazed, but no more. For a moment he lay still, trying to collect his wits. Then he heard Charles saying, "Are you hurt? Hurt bad?" Man answered me, "Are you all right?" "I am saved," Mark Twain thought. "I don't know," he said in the weakest voice he could counterfeit. "I feel all funny. I don't think there's anything broken." The next instant, all the family was crowded worriedly beside him, assuring him that he could not make his journey back, that he must come in the house and they would call a doctor. It took Mark Twain 2 weeks to recover from that little bump, and he left Elmira at end of that time feeling that he had pretty good chance of claiming the heart of the girl he loved. On the way, he had thought to impress Olivia was to have her help him in saving himself. He presented himself to her as one of the fallen who might still be saved, and he let her know it was her duty to save souls, his in particular. He asked her if she would write letters of encouragement to him while he was away. His answers to her pious epistles on salvation showed a great deal more than just a friendly interest in the state of his soul. In 1868, he took to lecturing again, using the material from his voyage to the Holy Land. He had a chance, since one of his lecture dates was near Elmira, to stop by the house again. This time he pressed his suit earnestly and Mr. Langdon agreed to consider it. He asked Mark for a list of people who would testify that his character was honorable and that he would be a good husband for Livy. Mark gave him the names of several influential people he knew, men he knew not too well, but those names he thought would impress Mr. Langdon and who would not be too hard on him in giving character references since they knew him only slightly. In January of the following year, he went back to Elmira with high hopes. He had been writing Olivia constantly and had reason to believe that she had begun to return his affections. But it was a glum Mr. Langdon who greeted him. They were no sooner in the living room together than Mr. Langdon asked for a private conference with Mark in the library. All of the so-called character references had written letters violently attacking Mark and warning the Langdon family against him. Two of the writers announced their belief that Mark Twain was headed for the drunkard graves, and the other four were blackly pessimistic. When Mr. Langdon confronted the lover with this so-called objective opinion, he said, "What kind of people are these? Haven't you a friend in the world?" "Apparently not. I will be your friend myself. Take the girl. I know you better than they do." Later, Livy's father heard her new fiancé talking of Joey Goodman of the Territorial Enterprise. Mr. Langdon asked if Goodman was a particular friend, and Mark Twain replied that he was the best one of he ever had. "Why, then," said Mr. Langdon, "what could you have been thinking of? Why didn't you refer me to him?" "Because he would have lied just as straightforwardly on the other side. The others gave all the vices. Goodman would have given me all the virtues. You wanted unprejudiced testimony. Of course, I knew you wouldn't get it from Goodman. I did believe you would get it from those others, and possibly you did, but it was certainly less complimentary than I was expecting." Mark Twain was making $100 a lecture, and he thought he could afford to get married. He knew that Livy was used to the very best, but that was not the thing that would prevent their marriage. The truth was that Livy had been over-sheltered and overprotected all her life. Neither her mother or father wanted her to marry any man, let alone one who was known to use profanity and play cards for money. Moreover, Livy's father had boasted that so long as he was alive, no man would take her away from him. Jervis Langdon had changed his mind quite a bit since the day of that boast, but there were still obstacles before the pair could be married. Mark got a loan of $12,500 from Livy's father to take a partnership in the Buffalo Express, but he still felt that he needed more financial security. Finally, literature came to his rescue. Innocents Abroad, his sketches of the people who had made the trip on the Quaker City, sold so well that he could forget his financial worries. He was earning well over $1,000 a month from its amazing success, and over 100,000 copies of the book were sold the first year. On February 2nd, 1870 to 70, Mark Twain, 34, a prominent author, a rake who was presumably reformed, inverted comma, he was to fall again and again, comma, complete, full stop, and the happiest man in the world that day married Olivia Langdon. The following day, the whole Langdon family with friends took a special train to Buffalo. I knew nothing about Buffalo, Mark Twain recalled in his autobiography, but I had made my household arrangements there through a friend. By letter, I had instructed him to find a boarding house of respectable a character as my light salary as editor would command. We were received at about 9 o'clock at the station in Buffalo and were put into several sleighs and driven all over America, as it seemed to me, for apparently we turned all the corners in the town and followed all the streets there were, I scolding freely and characterizing that friend of mine in very uncomplimentary ways for securing a boarding house that apparently had no definite locality. But there was a conspiracy, and my bride knew of it, but I was in ignorance. Her father, Jervis Langdon, had bought and furnished a new house for us in the fashionable street, Delaware Avenue, and had laid in a cook and housemaids and a brisk and electric young coachman, an Irishman, Patrick McAleer, and we were being driven all over that city in order that one sleighful of these people could have time to go to the house and see that the gas was lighted all over it and a hot supper prepared for the crowd. We arrived at last, and when I entered that very place, my indignation reached high water mark, and without any reserve, I delivered my opinion to that friend of mine for being so stupid as to put us into boarding house whose terms would be far out to my reach. Then Mr. Langdon brought forward a very pretty box and opened it and took from it a deed of the house. So the comedy ended very pleasantly, and we sat down to supper. The new couple spent a happy winter, but then Levy's father died, and she was hard hit by the loss. In November 1870, a son Langdon was born prematurely. The child was frail, and the two parents watched anxiously over him. As the months passed, the little boy's health improved, but he was never strong. Mark and Livy left Buffalo soon after the birth of their son. The express had become a financial burden, and the Clemencies did not find the society of Buffalo very congenial, suitable. Mark decided they would make their home in Hartford, Connecticut, which at the time was a publishing center and had attracted many writers.